And Boleyn's life is a tale of ambition, love, and betrayal. Born around 1501 into the English aristocracy, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a man of noble blood, and Elizabeth Howard, both of whom had significant connections in the royal court. But despite her noble background, Anne's early life was far from ordinary. She spent her childhood in the Netherlands and France, where she was exposed to the sophisticated and often tumultuous politics of European courts. It was during her time in France that Anne's ambitions began to take shape. Influenced by the culture of the French court, which celebrated intelligence, grace, and influence, and developed a sharp wit, a keen sense of diplomacy, and a remarkable ability to attract attention. By 1522, Anne returned to England, and her beauty and intellect quickly caught the eye of the English court. She served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the wife of King Henry VIII. Despite her loyalty to the Queen, Anne soon became the object of Henry's affections. Their love story was one of passion and power, but also one of tension and political upheaval. The king, desperate for a male heir, had been married to Catherine for over 2 decades without producing a surviving son. The failure of Catherine to provide him with a male heir made Henry increasingly desperate, and he soon set his sights on Anne, whom he believed could give him the son he desired. At first, Anne resisted Henry's advances. She was not simply a mistress, she had ambitions of her own. Anne's refusal to become Henry's mistress and her insistence on marriage was a bold move that played into her desire for power and status. It was a position that many would have considered impossible to maintain, given Henry's power and the expectation that women would submit to the desires of monarchs. But Anne, determined and shrewd, was not like other women. Her defiance set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of English history. In 1525, Henry began to pursue Anne more seriously, and soon after, he sought an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. Anne's refusal to become Henry's mistress, coupled with the king's desperation for a male heir, pushed him to take drastic steps. Henry's attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine was thwarted by the Catholic Church, which refused to grant him a divorce. In response, Henry took matters into his own hands. He broke from the Catholic Church and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, establishing the Anglican Church. This bold move paved the way for his marriage to Anne in 1533. The wedding was a remarkable and controversial event. Anne's coronation as queen consort was celebrated, but the joy was short-lived. She was pregnant with Henry's child, but the birth of a son, so desperately desired by the king, did not come. Instead, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of the most famous monarchs in English history. At the time, however, the birth of a daughter was seen as a failure by Henry, who had hoped for a male heir. Anne's inability to produce a son placed a strain on their relationship, and soon, whispers of her downfall began to circulate. Anne's failure to secure a male heir was not her only problem. The political landscape in England was shifting, and Henry's attentions began to wander. Anne's sharp wit, her ambitious nature, and her increasingly desperate desire to secure her position as queen made her many enemies at court. There were those who viewed Anne as an obstacle to the political stability they sought, and they began to conspire against her. Her downfall was further fueled by the rise of Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting who became the king's new obsession. By 1536, Anne's world was crumbling. She had lost Henry's affection, and her enemies were closing in. The birth of Elizabeth had failed to secure her position as queen, and her inability to provide a male heir had made her an unpopular figure at court. As Henry's attention shifted to Jane Seymour, Anne became more isolated. Her enemies, including powerful figures like Thomas Cromwell, saw an opportunity to bring her down. It was a combination of political maneuvering, personal vendettas, and accusations of treason that sealed Anne's fate. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and high treason, charges that were fabricated to remove her from power. Her enemies were eager to see her fall, and the king, weary of her, did nothing to intervene. Anne was thrown into the Tower of London, where she was held in confinement, awaiting trial. The trial was a mockery of justice. and was accused of conspiring with several men at court, including her own brother, George Boleyn. These men were also charged with treason and adultery, though no real evidence was ever presented against them. The accusations were based largely on rumor, manipulation, and fabricated testimonies. Anne, who had once been one of the most powerful women in England, now found herself facing a court that had already decided her fate. Despite her protests of innocence, Anne was found guilty of all charges. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, and Anne was sentenced to death. The king, now determined to be rid of her, agreed to spare her the traditional execution by burning, which would have been reserved for women convicted of treason. Instead, Anne was granted the mercy of a beheading, a death that was considered more dignified for a queen. But even this mercy was an illusion, as Anne's fate had already been sealed. The news of her conviction shocked the court and the nation. Anne, who had once been the Queen of England, was now a prisoner awaiting execution. Her final days were filled with uncertainty and dread. As she awaited her fate, Anne was visited by a priest who urged her to confess her sins, but Anne maintained her innocence. She had been accused of betrayal, of plotting against the king, but in her heart, she knew that she was being used as a pawn in a larger political game. She had always been a woman of strong convictions, and she would not bend to the demands of those who sought her destruction. As the day of her execution drew near, Anne faced her final moments with courage. She knew that she was walking toward her death, but she refused to show fear. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to the scaffold at the Tower of London. Surrounded by a crowd of spectators, she faced her final moments with grace and dignity. She addressed the crowd, thanking them for their support and maintaining her composure in the face of certain death. With one final prayer, Anne knelt before the executioner. The blow came swiftly, and the queen who had once held all of England in her grasp was no more. Her death sent shockwaves through England and the court. In a nation ruled by political maneuvering and intrigue, the fall of Anne Boleyn was the culmination of power struggles, ambitions, and betrayals. The execution of Anne Boleyn marked the end of a tumultuous chapter in English history, and her legacy would continue to resonate through the centuries. The story of her rise to power, her marriage to Henry VIII, her tragic fall, and her untimely death would become one of the most iconic tales of ambition and political intrigue. The events surrounding Anne Boleyn's trial and execution were not just a personal tragedy, but a reflection of the treacherous and unstable political climate of Tudor England. The king's desire for a male heir and his shifting affections had set the stage for Anne's dramatic fall, but it was the ruthless maneuvering of courtly rivals, most notably Thomas Cromwell, that ensured her ultimate downfall. The charges against Anne were so grave and fabricated that they have long been regarded as a miscarriage of justice, an example of how power and ambition could be weaponized in the court of Henry VIII. In the months leading up to Anne's arrest, rumors had begun to swirl around the court. Anne, who had once been so powerful and beloved, had become increasingly isolated. She had lost the king's favor, and his eyes had turned to Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting whose docile nature and gentle demeanor seemed to offer everything that Anne could not. Anne's failure to produce a male heir had left her vulnerable, and the king's infatuation with Jane only added fuel to the fire. As Anne's enemies began to circle, Cromwell, ever the calculating strategist, saw an opportunity to rid the court of a queen who had become an obstacle to the king's desires and his own ambitions. By the time Anne was arrested in May 1536, the charges against her were already decided. The accusations ranged from adultery with multiple men at court, including her own brother George Boleyn, to plotting the death of the king. The charges were outlandish and, as it would later become clear, entirely fabricated. There was no real evidence against Anne, only hearsay, manipulation, and the desperate need to rid the kingdom of a woman who had once wielded immense power. Anne's enemies at court, including members of the old queen's faction, were eager to see her fall. The king, weary of her defiance and consumed by his own desires, made no move to protect her. The stage was set for the trial that would seal Anne's fate. Anne was brought to trial at the Tower of London in May 1536, and it quickly became clear that the proceedings were nothing more than a formality. The court was stacked against her, and the outcome had already been decided. The charges were read out, one by one, each more outrageous than the last. Anne, the queen who had once held the crown, was now accused of crimes that carried the harshest penalties: adultery, incest, and treason. The accusation of incest with her brother, George, was particularly absurd, based on no evidence other than forced confessions and the testimony of men who were later executed for the same alleged crimes. The charges of treason were equally unfounded, as there was no clear evidence of any conspiracy to harm the king. Despite the absurdity of the accusations, Anne's trial proceeded with ruthless efficiency. The court, led by judges who were either too loyal to the crown or too frightened of the consequences to speak out, quickly found her guilty. Anne's defenders were silenced, and she had no opportunity to call witnesses in her defense. Instead, the trial was a spectacle, with Anne as the accused, but the real crime was being played out behind the scenes, the power struggle between rival factions at court, each vying for their own interests. Thomas Cromwell had orchestrated the entire process, and Henry VIII, no longer in love with Anne and desperate to marry Jane Seymour, had made up his mind. The trial was a mere formality to justify what was already a foregone conclusion. Anne's defense was dignified, yet futile. She maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings, and even when asked about her alleged affair with her brother, George, she calmly denied the charge. Her dignity and composure throughout the trial only highlighted the injustice of what was happening. But the court, which was packed with Henry's supporters, had already made up its mind. Anne was found guilty of adultery, incest, and treason. Her sentence was clear: death by beheading. As Anne was led back to her cell in the Tower, she must have been struck with a deep sense of disbelief. The Queen, who had once been the most powerful woman in England, whose marriage had caused a rift with the Catholic Church and set the nation on a new religious course, was now facing the ultimate punishment for crimes she did not commit. It was not just her life that had been taken from her, but her legacy, her family, and the future of her daughter, Elizabeth, who would one day become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. While Anne languished in the Tower awaiting her execution, Henry's attentions turned fully to Jane Seymour, who had already been quietly positioned as his next wife. Jane's demure and submissive personality made her the perfect contrast to Anne's intelligence and ambition. Henry, who had once been captivated by Anne's wit and charm, was now disillusioned by what he saw as her manipulative behavior and her failure to provide a male heir. In the end, it was not love that had driven Henry's decisions but an obsession with securing his dynasty through a male successor. As Anne's fate was sealed, Jane Seymour became the focus of Henry's desire, and their marriage soon followed. Anne's final days in the Tower were spent in a state of resigned despair. She had been stripped of everything: her title, her dignity, and her freedom. Yet, in her final moments, Anne found the strength to face her death with courage. She was visited by several priests, including her confessor, who urged her to confess her sins. Anne, however, remained steadfast in her innocence, maintaining that she had never betrayed her husband. She had been a victim of political manipulation and false accusations, and in her heart, she knew that her only crime had been her ambition and her refusal to accept a subordinate role at court. She had dared to dream of a future where she could rule as queen, but the world had turned against her. As the day of her execution approached, Anne's composure remained intact. She knew that she was walking toward her death, but she refused to show fear. Her final words were not filled with bitterness or anger but with an expression of gratitude. She thanked the crowd for their support and comforted those who would mourn her death. She had been a queen, but she would die as a woman who had lost everything. The scaffold where she would meet her fate had been set up in the Tower of London, and the crowd, though sympathetic, was eager to see justice done. Anne had been tried, convicted, and sentenced, and now there was no turning back. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn's final moments arrived, and the tragic culmination of her rise and fall played out before a watching world. The scaffold at the Tower of London, where Anne would meet her end, was a grim but public stage for her execution. The decision to execute Anne by beheading, rather than the more brutal method of burning, may have been seen as a merciful gesture for a queen, but it offered little comfort. As Anne made her way to the scaffold, surrounded by guards and under heavy guard, she must have known this would be the end of her turbulent journey. It would be the end of her marriage to Henry VIII, the death of her ambitions, and the quiet, unforgiving severing of her personal and political dreams. In the days leading up to the execution, Anne had spent hours in the Tower with her confessor and other religious advisors. She was urged to confess her sins, to admit guilt in the face of overwhelming charges, but Anne remained resolute. She knew her conscience was clear. Despite the false accusations, Anne continued to maintain her innocence, asserting that she had never committed the crimes for which she was condemned. Yet, Anne also knew that in the court of Henry VIII, innocence mattered little when the king's will was unshakable. The whispers of her enemies and the political necessity of removing her from the throne made her demise inevitable. For all her resilience, Anne could not escape the weight of courtly politics, betrayal, and the ambitions of those around her. The day of her execution began early. Anne was given a simple gown to wear, stark and humble compared to the rich finery she once wore as queen. Her hands were bound, and as she was led through the Tower toward the scaffold, it is said she maintained a steady and composed demeanor. She passed through the crowds of onlookers, some who jeered and some who gazed at her with sympathy. Anne's composure in those final moments revealed a woman who had come to terms with the fact that she was now a prisoner of history. Her once glorious reign as queen was over, and the only thing left was her death. Once she reached the scaffold, and addressed the crowd in a final act of defiance and grace. She thanked those who had been loyal to her, acknowledging their support despite the circumstances. And did not express bitterness, nor did she curse those who had conspired against her. She spoke with an air of quiet dignity, the mark of a woman who had known both the heights of power and the depths of despair. Anne's words were measured, and despite the terror she must have felt, she maintained her poise. She would not give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her break. As Anne knelt on the scaffold, her final prayer was spoken softly, seeking solace in the knowledge that she was not guilty of the crimes she had been accused of. Then, in a moment that would be etched into the annals of English history, she was prepared for her execution. The executioner, a skilled swordsman who had been brought from France to carry out the beheading, raised his sword. Anne's final moments on earth were brief. The blow fell swiftly, ending her life, and her body was unceremoniously placed in a common grave with no monument marking her final resting place. The queen who had once ruled England was gone, and the woman who had been at the heart of the court's power struggles was reduced to a tragic symbol of ambition, betrayal, and loss. The immediate aftermath of Anne's execution was marked by a complicated reaction from the court. While Henry VIII swiftly moved on, marrying Jane Seymour just days after Anne's death, his actions left an indelible mark on English history. For Anne, the fall of her once promising reign marked a shifting dynamic in the Tudor court, a court built on power plays, shifting alliances, and the constant pursuit of a male heir. As Anne had failed to provide Henry with a son, Jane Seymour was now expected to fulfill that role, a task that was viewed by Henry as critical to the survival of the Tudor dynasty. His obsession with securing a male heir would continue to define his actions for the rest of his life. But while Henry's desire for a son led to Anne's tragic end, it was ultimately Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, who would rise from the ashes of her mother's death to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I's reign would define the golden age of England, and she would lead the nation to prosperity, security, and cultural flourishing. As such, Anne Boleyn's legacy, though marred by tragedy, would live on through her daughter, whose strength, intelligence, and political acumen echoed Anne's own qualities. In the years following Anne's execution, her story was retold in countless ways, from gossip at court to ballads in the streets. Over time, historians and scholars have debated the true nature of Anne's relationship with Henry, the motivations behind her trial, and the lasting consequences of her rise and fall. But what remains clear is that Anne Boleyn's death was not the end of her story, it was a turning point in the history of England. Her death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, and in her daughter, the power and influence that Anne had sought during her own life would eventually be realized in ways she could not have imagined. As for her reputation, Anne's legacy has undergone many transformations. In the years immediately following her death, she was vilified as a woman who had betrayed her king and brought about the fall of the monarchy. But in modern times, historians have come to view her as a victim of the political intrigues of the court, a woman who was destroyed by the very system that had once elevated her. Anne Boleyn, who had been a young woman of great ambition, a queen of sharp intellect, and a mother to a future monarch, became both a tragic figure and a symbol of the ruthlessness of the Tudor court. Her story is a reminder of the fragility of power, the consequences of ambition, and the dangerous game of politics that was played at the highest levels of Tudor England. In the end, Anne Boleyn's last breath may have marked the physical end of her life, but it was also the beginning of a historical legacy that would continue to captivate the world. The queen who was once admired and beloved by the court would be remembered for her courage, her intelligence, and her ultimate sacrifice. The death of Anne Boleyn serves as a cautionary tale, a reflection of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the treacherous nature of power. Her rise and fall, her trial, her execution, and the long-lasting impact she had on English history continue to echo through time, making Anne Boleyn one of the most enduring and tragic figures in the annals of English history.